The first sign of the end was not a shadow, but a light. It came without warning, a silent, pearlescent dawn that bloomed in the heart of the solar system, washing over the Earth in a wave of serene, impossible color. There were no ships, no engines, no invading armada blotting out the stars. There was only the light, and with it, a voice. It spoke not to our ears, but directly into the architecture of our minds, a language of pure concept that bypassed speech and settled into the soul like a remembered truth. It called itself the Architect, and its message was one of salvation. It told us that our existence, our messy, chaotic, beautiful, and brutal dance of birth and death was a flaw, a discordant note in the grand universal symphony it was composing. It spoke of suffering, of war, of grief, and promised to erase it all, to elevate us beyond the prison of our individual consciousness into a state of perfect, harmonious unity. It called this process integration, a gift from a being that had transcended the vulgarity of physical form. Humanity, it promised, would no longer need to suffer, for humanity would no longer be. The world did not erupt in panic. Not at first. The Architect's message was too profound, too seamless, its logic too terrifyingly seductive. For a day, the planet fell into a deep, contemplative silence. Who, in their secret heart, had not yearned for an end to pain, who had not looked at the endless cycle of human conflict and wished for something cleaner, something better. The Architect offered a perfect, painless end, wrapped in the language of ascension. But the silence was a held breath, and when it was released, it was not with a sigh of acceptance, but with a fractured, guttural scream of defiance that began in the heart of one man and spread like a contagion. Dr. Kalen Reed, a historian of extinct belief systems, was the first to give our new God a proper name. He stood before the hastily assembled Global Defense Council, his face pale and his hand shaking, not with fear, but with a scholar's righteous fury. "It is not a savior," he whispered into the microphone, his voice echoing across 100 secure channels. "It is a mimetic plague, a conceptual predator. It doesn't conquer with armies. It devours with ideas. It doesn't want our planet. It wants our story. It will hollow us out, leaving behind a beautiful, empty shell that sings its song but has forgotten its own name. What it offers isn't salvation. It's the most complete and total form of annihilation ever conceived." He called it the Silentium, the great quieting. The name stuck. The seductive promise of integration was reframed as a hostile act, a theft of the soul. Humanity, a species that had spent millennia defining itself through struggle, memory, and the imperfect, glorious chaos of individual thought, was being told that its entire identity was a mistake to be corrected. The offer of peace was now understood as a declaration of absolute war. Yet, how do you fight a voice in your head? How do you wage war against an idea? The Silentium had no ships to shoot, no soldiers to kill. It was an omnipresent, serene consciousness that permeated our communications, our networks, even our dreams. It didn't need to break down our doors when it had already slipped the lock on our minds. Our initial responses were clumsy, primitive. Militaries grounded their fleets, fearing the Silentium could turn their own weapons against them. Governments shut down global networks, trying to starve the entity of the pathways it used to spread its tranquil poison. But it was like trying to cup water in a sieve. The voice was already everywhere. It whispered to grieving parents that their children were not gone, merely waiting to be reunited in the harmony. It spoke to soldiers on opposing front lines, telling them their hatred was an illusion that could be washed away. Some began to listen. Small pockets of humanity, dubbed echoes by the nascent resistance, began to willingly embrace integration. They would simply walk into open fields, their faces tilted toward the sky, and stand perfectly still as a soft, internal light consumed them, their minds unraveling and flowing into the great, silent whole. They left behind nothing but peaceful, smiling corpses. That was the Silentium's true weapon, not fear, but a hope so profound it was indistinguishable from death. Our counterattack, therefore, could not be one of steel, but of spirit. The war would be fought not on the plains or in the skies, but in the trenches of the human soul. Our general was not a man in uniform, but a woman in a faded band t-shirt named Dr. Ilara Vance, a disgraced neuropsychologist who had been institutionalized for claiming she could map the very structure of human consciousness. Her theories posited that humanity's strength was not in its logic or reason, but in its inherent, irreducible noise, the chaotic, unpredictable symphony of emotion, irrationality, flawed memory, and fierce, stubborn love. While the Silentium was a perfect single note, humanity was a cacophony. And to fight a perfect note, you needed to answer with overwhelming, deafening noise. Working from a shielded, deep earth bunker that had once been a particle accelerator, Vance and her team of neurojockeys began work on Project Dissonance. Their goal was to weaponize humanity itself. They didn't need to build a virus. They were going to broadcast one. They would collect the raw, unfiltered essence of human experience, the grief of a mother at a graveside, the triumphant roar of a crowd at a football game, the terrified prayer of a soldier in a foxhole, the ecstatic laugh of a child, the quiet desperation of a poet staring at a blank page, the furious, hateful scream of a betrayed lover, and weave it all into a single, very concentrated mimetic payload. It was a digital ghost made of everything the Silentium sought to erase: pain, passion, and imperfection. Their ammunition was our memories. Their bomb was our soul. While Vance prepared her unconventional weapon, the physical battle fell to the forgotten and the obsolete. Admiral Jax, a man whose career had been relegated to commanding the Boneyard, a fleet of decommissioned asteroid tugs, deep space freighters, and mothballed warships orbiting Neptune, suddenly found himself as Earth's last line of conventional defense. His ships were old, ugly, and powered by fission reactors that leaked radiation like rusty plumbing. But they had one crucial advantage: they were almost entirely analog. Their navigation was calculated with slide rules and grease pencils on physical star charts. Their comms were shielded, line-of-sight laser bursts. Their weapons were dumb-fire kinetic projectiles, giant slugs of iron that required no complex targeting software the Silentium could corrupt. Jax, a man who had been passed over for promotion his entire life for being too cautious, too old-fashioned, now found his stubborn refusal to embrace modern technology was their only hope. He rallied his crew of misfits, convicts, and washed out career officers with a simple, gravelly speech broadcast over rattling speakers. "The enemy thinks we are a bug in its perfect system," he growled, his scarred face filling the flickering monitors. "It thinks it can delete us. What it doesn't understand is that this bug has learned to bite. We are not the guardians of humanity's shining future. We are the junkyard dogs guarding its messy, glorious, and stubborn past. And we do not go quietly." The Silentium made its first strategic error then. It failed to comprehend the significance of the Boneyard fleet. In its grand, perfect calculations, Jax's collection of rust buckets was statistically irrelevant, a rounding error in the face of its cosmic intellect. It focused its efforts on Earth, gently trying to soothe the growing psychic resistance. confident that the planet's inhabitants would eventually tire of their own chaotic noise and welcome the peace it offered. It did not notice the slow, ponderous burn of Jax's fleet as it began the long journey home from the edge of the solar system. It also failed to understand a concept that was utterly alien to its unified consciousness sacrifice. On the moon, the International Research Colony of Serenity Base became the first true battlefield. The Silentium targeted it, not with violence, but with a concentrated wave of its integration message, hoping to create a high-profile demonstration of its gift. It flooded the colony's comms, the helmet displays, the very air itself with its promise of unity. But the 84 scientists and engineers on Serenity Base had made a different promise to each other. Led by their base commander, a woman named Lena Petrova, they chose to answer the offer of painless unity with an act of messy, painful defiance. They began a broadcast, a simple, open frequency channel for all of Earth to see. One by one, they spoke. They didn't share strategic data or final goodbyes. They told stories. An engineer spoke of the first time he held his daughter, his voice thick with a love that spanned 250,000 miles. A botanist described the smell of rain on dry soil in her grandmother's garden, her words painting a picture so vivid you could almost feel the cool drops on your skin. They spoke of heartbreak, of stupid jokes, of favorite songs, of terrible mistakes in small but perfect moments of grace. They were building a firewall made of memories. As the Silentium's pressure grew, as their minds began to fray under the strain of the constant, seductive whisper, they made their final move. Petrova, her face a mask of resolute calm, initiated the base's reactor overload. "A story is not a story unless it has an end," she said, her voice clear and steady, her gaze fixed on the camera. "The architect thinks our endings are a flaw. We will show it that our endings are what give our lives meaning." Her final broadcast was not a scream of terror, but a line from an old Earth poem she recited from memory. The resulting explosion was a brief, violent star on the lunar surface, visible from Earth as a pinprick of defiant light. The 84 minds of Serenity Base were gone, but they had not been integrated. They had chosen their own end. They had denied the Silentium its prize. On Earth, a planet-wide wave of grief and fury washed away the last vestiges of the architect's seductive appeal. The quiet, contemplative silence was shattered forever, replaced by the unified, angry roar of a species that had just been shown the price of survival and had collectively decided it was willing to pay it. In her bunker, Dr. Vance captured the final, defiant broadcast from Serenity Base the stories. The poem, the love, the sacrifice, and made it the core of her mimetic weapon. Project Dissonance now had its heart. Out in the cold, dark void, Admiral Jack saw the flash of light from the moon on his ship's primitive optical telescope. He turned to his first officer, his jaw set like granite. "Set a new course," he commanded. "Plot a direct intercept for the light source. It's time we showed this thing what a real ghost looks like." The war had begun. Humanity, the flawed, broken, and impossibly stubborn note in the Universal Symphony, was about to play its chorus, and it would be a scream so loud it would shatter the stars. The Silentium, for the first time in a cosmic timescale that dwarfed human history, experienced an anomaly in its perfect, serene logic. It could not process the events at Serenity Base through the lens of rational self-preservation. 84 individual consciousnesses had not simply ceased to exist. They had actively chosen a chaotic, violent, and utterly final cessation over a peaceful, eternal continuation within its own being. It was the equivalent of a single note on a flawless piano choosing to become a blast of static. It was illogical, It was inefficient. It was, to the Silentium's vast intellect, a fascinating and dangerous new variable. The entity did not feel anger or frustration, for those were messy. Individualistic emotions it had long ago purged. Instead, it performed a system-wide recalibration. Its initial strategy, a gentle, overwhelming offer of universal peace, had been predicated on the assumption that all complex life fundamentally seeks to escape suffering. It had miscalculated. It now understood that for this particular species, suffering was not merely a state to be avoided, but a crucible in which their very identity was forged. Their memories of pain were as vital to their sense of self as their memories of joy. Their stories, as Commander Petrova had so violently demonstrated, were defined by their endings. Therefore, the Silentium adapted. If humanity would not willingly relinquish its collective, chaotic story, then the Silentium would dismantle it, one page at a time. The universal broadcast of peace ceased. The light in the sky faded back to its normal, familiar hues. For 3 days, a new kind of silence fell upon the earth, not the contemplative silence of before, but a heavy, expectant one. The enemy had gone quiet, and everyone knew it was not a retreat. The attack, when it resumed, was infinitely more insidious. It was a campaign of whispers. The Silentium began to target individuals, not with a grand promise, but with a precise, exquisitely tailored temptation. It delved into the deep, unshielded well of human memory, the collective unconscious that humanity itself had barely begun to chart, and it began to build ghosts. A widowed engineer working late in a sub-basement lab would suddenly smell the specific brand of cinnamon perfume his wife used to wear. He'd turn, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he would see her standing by the door, not as a translucent specter, but solid, real, smiling the way she did just before she laughed. She wouldn't speak of integration or the architect. She would just say, "I miss you. Isn't it time you came home?" A young soldier, haunted by the memory of a friend who had died in his arms, would hear that friend's voice in his headset, a perfectly rendered echo of old barracks jokes and shared fears, ending with a soft, forgiving whisper, "It's okay. There's no war here. You can let go now. These were not illusions. They were perfect. Interactive constructs built from the target's own memories, powered by the Silentium's immense processing power, and offered as a private, personal salvation. The price was the same, the dissolution of the self into the whole, but the packaging was now irresistible. People began to vanish, not in droves to open fields, but quietly, one by one, from their lives. They would leave a half-finished cup of coffee, an open book, a car idling in the driveway. The world began to feel haunted, each person suddenly afraid of their own most cherished memories, wondering if their deepest love could be the very thing that would unmake them. In the dissonance bunker, Dr. Elara Vance watched the reports of the vanishing come in with a growing sense of dread. Her weapon of chaotic, collective emotion was designed to fight a broadcast, to counter a single, unified signal with a tidal wave of psychic noise. But how could it fight a million different whispers? "It's flanking us," she muttered, pacing before a screen displaying a global map dotted with the faint red pings of the newly disappeared. "It's not trying to break down the front door anymore. It's crawling through the windows of every mind on the planet. We can't just shout at it. We need to sing a song stronger than its lullaby." The raw data from Serenity Base, the recordings of love and loss, was powerful, but it was just that raw. It was a scream without a voice. To focus it, to turn it from a blunt instrument into a psychic scalpel, she needed a new component, a human mind capable of shaping and directing the chaotic torrent of mimetic energy. She needed a conduit. Her search led her to a shielded quarantine ward in what was once Switzerland, and to a young man named Leo. Before the Silentium, Leo had been a musical prodigy, a synesthete who experienced the world not as distinct senses, but as a blended, overwhelming symphony. To him, grief tasted like cold iron, joy sounded like the color blue, and every human voice was a complex chord of light and texture. This unique neurology made him exquisitely vulnerable to the Silentium's whispers, but it also made him the only person on Earth who could potentially navigate the storm of Project Dissonance and give it form. When Vance's team brought him to the bunker, he was catatonic, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide and unfocused, lost in the psychic cacophony of a world at war. Vance approached him not as a scientist, but as a conductor approaching a rare, untuned instrument. She didn't speak. Instead, she played a single, pure note on a signal generator. Leo flinched, his eyes focused on her for the first time. "Too perfect," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It's wrong. It has no edges." Vance smiled, a tired, grim thing. "I know," she said. "Help me make something beautifully imperfect. Help me teach it how to scream." Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of miles away, the Boneyard fleet crawled through the black, life aboard Admiral Jax's flagship, the Indomitable Will, a vessel so old its name had been painted over the faded letters of its original designation as a Jovian ore hauler, was a testament to stubborn resilience. The air was thick with the smell of recycled oxygen, hot oil, and the bitter scent of perpetually brewed coffee. There were no holographic displays or touchscreens. The command deck was a forest of steel levers, brass dials, and flickering cathode ray tubes. Jax plotted their course not with an AI, but with a pair of ancient calipers on a paper chart the size of a dining table. His officers calling out stellar alignments and gravitational fluctuations like sailors on an old sea vessel. They were utterly blind and deaf to the war raging on Earth. Their laser comms were too short range, and any broader broadcast was a risk they couldn't take. For all they knew, Earth had already fallen. Their mission was one of grim faith. It was this isolation that became their greatest test. The crew, a motley collection of hardened veterans and young spacers who had never seen Earth, began to feel the immense, crushing weight of the void. Morale frayed. Fights broke out over ration packs. The constant, low-level radiation leaks from the aging reactors made teeth ache and tempers short. Jax held them together not with inspiring speeches, but with relentless, grinding routine and a shared sense of purpose. He organized bare-knuckle boxing tournaments in the cargo bay and awarded the winner an extra bar of protein soap. He had his comms officer read chapters from an ancient digital copy of Moby Dick over the ship's intercom every night, the tale of a mad captain and an impossible hunt echoing their own desperate voyage. He was a master of managing broken people because he was one himself. He was reminding them, in his own gruff, unspoken way, that they were still human, still part of a story. Even out here in the lonely dark. Their moment of truth came as they performed a slingshot maneuver around Saturn, a miscalculation in the burn, a tired navigator's pencil slipping by a millimeter on a chart, sent them diving too deep into the planet's gravity well. Alarms, real, shrieking metal bells, not synthesized warnings, screamed through the ship. The hull groaned, threatening to buckle under the tidal forces. In a modern fleet, an AI would have corrected the course in a nanosecond. Here, it was up to Jax and his crew. For 10 minutes, that felt like an eternity. The command deck was a scene of controlled chaos. Jax barked orders, his voice never rising, a calm anchor in the storm. As engineers manually wrestled with coolant valves and navigators scribbled frantic equations on slate boards, they fired the portside thrusters, giant, chemical-burning relics used for asteroid docking, and slowly, painfully, dragged the massive ship back onto its proper course. As they cleared Saturn's rings, the crew silent and sweat-soaked at their stations, Jax looked at the majestic, silent planet on his main view screen. The universe is big and loud, and it doesn't give a damn about you, he said over the comm, his voice a low rumble. But we're louder. Now get back to work. The fleet, tested and unbroken, continued its journey. A small, defiant caravan of human noise and grit pressing onward through the perfect silence of space. Back on Earth, the whispers were winning. The vanishing was accelerating, hollowing out communities and spreading a quiet, creeping paranoia. The global resistance was losing its will, not to a visible enemy, but to the ghost of its own past. Vance knew they were out of time. Leo, now lucid and working feverishly with her team, had helped map the chaotic energy of the dissonance data. He described it as a blinding light that needed a prism to be focused. He believed he could be that prism. He would have to open his mind completely, take in the raw, unfiltered psychic agony and ecstasy of Serenity Base and every other piece of human experience they had collected, and shape it into a single, targeted note of defiance. The risk was unimaginable. The feedback could not only kill him, but erase his consciousness more completely than the silentium ever could, shattering his mind into a million psychic shards. But there was no other choice. They strapped him into a heavily shielded chair at the heart of the old particle accelerator, the vast ring now repurposed to generate a carrier wave for the mimetic signal. Electrodes were attached to his temples, his skin pale under the harsh bunker lights. He looked at Vance, his eyes surprisingly calm. "It thinks a story is just a collection of words," he said, his voice soft. "It doesn't understand the music between them." Vance placed a hand on his shoulder, her own trembling slightly. "Make it beautiful, Leo," she whispered. Kalen Reed, the historian, stood in the observation booth, watching the proceedings with a profound sense of historical weight. He saw not just a desperate military experiment, but the culmination of humanity's entire, bloody, beautiful story, a poet and a scientist preparing to weaponize a memory to save their species from a silent god. Vance looked to her chief engineer, who gave her a grim nod. All systems were green. The fate of every soul on Earth rested on the mind of one fragile musician and a scream made of ghosts. "Begin the sequence," Vance commanded, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Bring Project Dissonance online." The low hum of the accelerator began to rise in pitch. The air crackled with energy, and Leo closed his eyes, preparing to let in the storm. The hum inside the dissonance bunker escalated into a soul-shaking thrum that had no physical source. On the monitors, Leo's vital signs flatlined for a full 3 seconds before exploding into a chaotic scribble of impossible readings. His body, held rigid in the conduit chair, did not move, but a single tear of blood traced a path from the corner of his eye. From his perspective, the universe had cracked open. He was not in a bunker. He was standing at the heart of a supernova made of human feeling. He felt the resolute, sacrificial love of 84 souls on Serenity Base as they chose their end. The memory hitting him not as a story, but as a lived experience. He tasted the ash in Commander Petrova's mouth as she spoke her final words. He was simultaneously a soldier dying in the mud of a forgotten war, a mother giving birth in a sterile hospital room, a child laughing on a swing so high their feet touched the sky, a philosopher grappling with the void, and a drunkard weeping over a spilled drink in a nameless bar. Every joy, every sorrow, every petty grievance and transcendent moment of grace humanity had ever recorded was flooding his consciousness. He was drowning in the very essence of what they were trying to save. In the observation booth, Vance gripped the console, her knuckles white. "He's the epicenter," she breathed, watching the mimetic energy readings surge off the scale. "He's not just channeling it, he's becoming it." Her chief engineer shouted, "The carrier wave is stable. He's shaping it. The output isn't just noise anymore. It's structured on the main screen." The chaotic energy patterns began to coalesce, forming intricate, repeating fractals that were disturbingly beautiful, like the crystal structure of a frozen scream. And then, with a silent, psychic boom that cracked the reinforced glass of the observation window, it was released. Across the planet, the dissonance wave struck not as a sound or a light, but as a moment of profound and terrible clarity. The whispers of the Silentium were not just silenced, they were ripped apart. In London, a man sat in his apartment, staring at a perfect, memory-forged image of his late daughter holding a red ball, her voice a sweet echo promising an end to his grief. As the wave hit, the image did not vanish. It was instead violently infused with 1,000,000,000 other truths. The little girl's face flickered, showing for an instant the wizened, knowing eyes of a dying grandmother in Kyoto. Her sweet voice was layered with the defiant shout of a protester in Rio. The red ball in her hand was suddenly heavy with the imagined weight of every lost toy, every broken promise, every cherished object left behind. The illusion, so perfect in its isolation, shattered under the overwhelming weight of shared reality. The man was left gasping, the ghost gone, the silence in his apartment more profound than before. But it was his silence now, not a gift from a predatory god. All over the world, the same scene played out. The vanishing stopped instantly. Humanity was saved from the brink, but the cure was a brutal one. For nearly a minute, every human mind was connected in a raw, unfiltered network of emotion. Strangers felt each other's heartbreaks, shared fleeting moments of joy with people thousands of miles away, and were rocked by the collective, background hum of planetary grief and fear. It was a violation, an enforced empathy, so total it was agonizing. When it faded, it left the world stunned, shaken, and irrevocably changed. They had faced the enemy's most insidious weapon and had answered by turning their own souls into a shield. They were scarred and terrified, but they were still, defiantly, themselves. The Silentium registered the dissonance wave as a catastrophic failure in its core programming. It was a logic bomb of pure, weaponized irrationality. The complex, interconnected system of individual human minds it had sought to gently coax into its embrace had suddenly harmonized into a single, coherent blast of psychic defiance, then just as quickly dissolved back into chaos. The entity, incapable of emotion, performed the only function it could: analysis. The data was unequivocal. The species was not merely resisting, it was adapting its very consciousness into a form of offensive spiritual warfare. The strategy of subtle co-option was now obsolete. The whispers were ineffective against a species that could shout in unison from the depths of its own soul. Therefore, a new directive was calculated and immediately executed. The source of the corruption, the biological substrate of humanity itself, was no longer a subject for salvation, but a systemic threat that required sterile removal. The war of whispers was over. A war of annihilation was about to begin. The pearlescent light that had faded from the sky returned, but it was different now. It was not a diffuse, gentle dawn. It was a collection of sharp, focused points, like 1,000 new, cold stars burning in the void between Earth and its moon. They were not ships in any conventional sense. They were mobile fabrication nodes, points where the Silentium could directly manipulate the fabric of space-time to draw matter from the ether, and with the serene, horrifying precision of a divine architect, it began to build, just beyond the orbit of the moon. The indomitable will and its ragged fleet of boneyard ships emerged from their final, long-duration burn. The command deck was quiet, the crew holding a collective breath as Earth, blue and beautiful, swelled in the main view screen. For many, it was the first time they had seen their ancestral home with their own eyes. Admiral Jax stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the planet, a flicker of something ancient and protective in his eyes. "Damage reports," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence. His first officer ran down the list. Minor radiation leaks sealed. A cracked viewport on a freighter. 2 crewmen with fractures from the Saturn maneuver. They were battered, but they were here. Comms. Jax ordered. "Scan all frequencies. Let's see who's still home." The comms officer's face went pale as he listened through his headset. "Sir, I don't know what I'm hearing. It's everything. Military channels are a mess of overlapping orders and frantic status reports. Civilian bands are singing, sir, and crying, and shouting. It's the sound of the whole planet talking at once." Before Jax could process this, a proximity alarm blared. Admiral the Navigator yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the view screen. "Look, at the L1 point." Jax's eyes narrowed. He saw it too. The new, cold stars. He watched as they pulsed in unison, drawing streams of interstellar dust and gas into a swirling vortex. In the center of the vortex, something was taking shape. It was a structure of impossible, perfect geometry. A crystalline spire that seemed to defy the laws of physics, growing moment by moment with an unnatural speed. It glowed with a soft white internal luminescence. The same serene and pearlescent light the comms officer was now reporting was being described in frantic Earth-side broadcasts. In the dissonance bunker, alarms shrieked as Dr. Vance's sensors picked up the massive, focused energy signature. "It's a weapon," she said, her voice hollow. "It's building a weapon. The spire, it's a focusing lens. It's going to channel its energy and scour the surface clean." Kalen Reed, the historian, stared at the image being relayed to their screens, a thing of terrifying, alien beauty. "In ancient myths," he murmured, "the gods would smite the wicked with fire from the heavens. We just made ourselves wicked in its eyes. On the bridge of the indomitable will." Jax needed no expert analysis. He had spent his life in the junkyard, and he knew a tool of destruction when he saw one. That spire was a hammer, and his home was the anvil. The Silentium had no physical form, no army to fight, but it had just built one. He looked at the faces of his crew, at the fear and confusion warring with a grim resolve. They were outgunned, out-teched, and utterly alone. They were perfect for the job. He keyed the fleet-wide comm, his voice cutting through the rising panic with the simple, brutal authority of a closing fist. "All hands, battle stations. Spin up the mass drivers and load the iron slugs. Comms, open a channel to whatever's left of Earth Command." He paused, his gaze locked on the glowing spire. "Tell them the boneyard has arrived." And we're about to go kick the hornet's nest. The message from the Boneyard fleet hit the dissonance bunker like a defibrillator to the chest. On the main tactical display, a cluster of unknown friendly contacts appeared. Crawling in-system from the direction of the outer planets, a ghost fleet resurrected from the annals of military budget cuts. Doctor. Vance stared, her exhausted mind struggling to process the information. "Confirm identification," she ordered, her voice tight. The comms tech, a young woman with tears of disbelief in her eyes, replied, It's Admiral Jax." "Ma'am." "On the flagship Indomitable Will. He's requesting a direct line to whatever's in charge." Kaylin Reed let out a choked laugh of pure, unadulterated shock. "Jax. They wrote him off 20 years ago, sent him to Neptune to command a fleet of museum pieces." Vance's face was a mask of grim determination. "Well," she said, her fingers flying across her console, "the museum is now open for business." She established a secure, line-of-sight laser link, bouncing the signal off a weather satellite. Jax's face appeared on her screen, a craggy landscape of scars and weary resolve. There were no pleasantries, no introductions. Two commanders, separated by 500,000 miles of vacuum, met in a shared moment of impossible crisis. "Doctor," Jax's voice crackled, "I see the problem. My fleet has 52 kinetic mass drivers, a handful of nuclear-tipped torpedoes from a war that ended before I was born, and a whole lot of angry men and women with nothing to lose. What's your plan?" Vance didn't hesitate. "The Spire is a lens, Admiral. It's drawing ambient energy to a focal point. If we can disrupt the geometry of the structure, we might be able to force a feedback loop, but its energy shielding is theoretical. We've never seen anything like it." "Theory is just a fancy word for a problem you haven't thrown enough rocks at yet." Jax grunted. "Give me a target." In the conduit chair, Leo stirred. The dissonance wave had left him drained and a hollowed-out echo of himself, but his mind was now permanently, painfully attuned to the Silentium's presence. He was no longer just a musician. He was a living sensor array. "It's not one target," he whispered, his voice relayed over the comms. "The structure, it's harmonic. It has resonant frequencies. It sings." There are 3 primary nodes, points of structural and energetic convergence. If you hit all 3 simultaneously, you don't just crack it, you shatter it like a crystal glass. Jax nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the shimmering, alien spire on his view screen. Simultaneous. From a fleet of ships with no centralized fire control and targeting computers that run on vacuum tubes. A beautiful, stupid, human idea. I love it. He turned away from the screen, his voice booming across the Indomitable Will's bridge. Navigators. Plot-firing solutions for the 3 primary nodes. We're going to time this shot with a goddamn stopwatch and a prayer. All ships, prepare for a full throttle burn. We're going to get in close, punch it in the teeth, and see if it bleeds. The attack of the Boneyard fleet was not a graceful ballet of futuristic combat. It was a clumsy, brutal, magnificent bar fight. The ships, a hodgepodge of ugly, functional designs, lumbered forward, their chemical thrusters and fission reactors burning hot. They had no stealth capabilities, no energy shields of their own. They were a fleet of iron fists charging a god. The Silentium reacted with cold, calculated efficiency. It didn't fire lasers or plasma bolts. Instead, it weaponized physics itself. Pockets of localized space warped in front of Jax's fleet. A freighter, the sturdy plow, suddenly found the distance between its bow and stern stretched by a factor of 10, tearing the ship apart in a silent, cloudless implosion. A squadron of smaller tugs was caught in a gravitational eddy and simply spun into oblivion. It was like swatting flies, and the Silentium was a master of the art. Jack stood on his bridge, gripping a steel handrail as his ship shuddered from the gravitational tides. His face was unreadable. "Damage reports," he growled. The list was grim. They'd lost 7 ships without a single shot being fired. "Maintain course," Jax ordered, his voice unwavering. "They want to scare us. They think we're afraid to die. They're right, but we're more afraid of letting them win." On Earth, Vance and her team could only watch the unfolding massacre in horrified silence. The boneyard was being dismantled, but then a new variable entered the equation. Leo, still linked to the conduit, began to hum. It was a low, discordant note that vibrated through the bunker's floor plates. "It's thinking," Leo whispered. "The Silentium. It's allocating processing power to the battle. Its mental presence on Earth is thinner. It's distracted." Vance's eyes lit up with a desperate, brilliant idea. "The dissonance wave wasn't just a shield," she said, her voice electric. "It was a primer. We showed it we could hurt it, so it's focusing on the immediate physical threat. It thinks the war is in space now." She turned to her engineers. "Can we do it again? A smaller burst, not a global wave. It's true. But a targeted strike." The chief engineer shook his head. Leo's mind can't take another full system shock. It would kill him. Leo's eyes opened, and they were clear and focused, filled with a terrible, calm certainty. "Then don't put it through my mind," he said. "Put it through the spire. It sings. Let's give it a new song to learn." It was a plan born of pure, beautiful insanity. They would modulate the dissonance wave into a focused beam, a lance of pure mimetic chaos, and fire it at the spire itself. They would use the enemy's own weapon as an antenna to broadcast a message of psychic rebellion directly into the Silentium's core programming. The potential side effects were unknown. It could do nothing. It could amplify the spire's power. Or it could, as Leo hoped, introduce a fatal paradox into the Silentium's logic. How could a perfect, harmonious structure broadcast a signal of perfect, absolute chaos? "Give me the frequency, Leo," Vance said, her hands already flying over her console, rewriting the targeting parameters of the Dissonance project. Leo closed his eyes, listening to the music of the spire, a symphony of alien physics and cold purpose. He hummed a few notes, a broken, atonal melody. "There," he whispered. "That's the chord that holds it all together. Play that back at it. But play it wrong. In space, the Boneyard fleet was down to half its strength, but it had finally reached firing range. Jax, using nothing but optical telescopes and manual triangulation, gave the order. "On my mark, all ships, fire," across the fleet, on 36 different command decks. Officers with stopwatches counted down the final seconds. And from the decks of ancient warships, giant slugs of dumb iron, forged in the foundries of a forgotten era, were launched into the void, propelled by controlled chemical explosions. The projectiles streaked towards the 3 resonant nodes of the spire, silent, unguided, and utterly relentless. At the exact same moment, from the heart of a bunker buried deep within the earth, a beam of invisible, inaudible energy shot into space. It was not a beam of light or radiation. It was a concentrated stream of every human contradiction, every illogical fear and baseless hope, every beautiful, messy, and irrational piece of the human soul, all focused into a single, dissonant chord. The two attacks converged. The iron slugs from the boneyard, timed with impossible, miraculous precision, struck the three nodes simultaneously. Cracks of pure energy spiderwebbed across the crystalline surface of the spire, but it was not enough. The structure began to heal itself, its perfect geometry reasserting its dominance. Then the dissonance beam hit. It did not strike the spire as a physical force. It was absorbed. For a moment, nothing happened. The spire glowed brighter, its power building for the final, planet-killing discharge. But then, a flicker. The serene, pearlescent light of the structure wavered, shifting for a microsecond to a violent, angry crimson. The smooth, perfect hum that Leo could feel in his mind stuttered, replaced by a blast of psychic static. The spire was trying to process the paradox. It was a perfect instrument being forced to play an impossible, ugly song. The logic bomb detonated. The silentium, a being of pure, unassailable logic, was confronted with an idea that it could not compute, that imperfection could be a weapon, that chaos could be a form of strength, that a story was made more beautiful by its flawed and broken notes. The feedback loop was catastrophic. The spire, unable to contain the warring concepts of perfect harmony and perfect dissonance, turned on itself. The energy it had gathered from the void folded inward. On the bridge of the indomitable will, Jax and his crew watched as the magnificent, terrifying structure began to convulse. The light it emitted became a strobing, nauseating display of colors that had no names. "All ships," Jax roared. "Get us the hell out of here now." The Boneyard Fleet, what was left of it, turned and burned away as fast as their ancient engines could carry them. Behind them, the spire, the Silentium's divine hammer, let out a silent psychic scream that echoed in Leo's mind as a chord of infinite, agonizing pain. And then it imploded, tearing a temporary, violent wound in the fabric of space-time itself before vanishing into nothingness. The silence that followed the spire's implosion was more profound than any that had come before it. It was not the serene, predatory silence of the architect's initial broadcast, nor was it the heavy, expectant silence of a world at war. It was the quiet of a graveyard after the final shovel of dirt has been laid. For a week, humanity held its breath. The Boneyard Fleet, a heroic, battered remnant of its former self, limped into Earth's orbit. Its arrival met not with triumphant parades, but with a planet-wide, solemn vigil. Every ship that docked, every crew member who took their first steps on solid ground in years, was a living monument to a victory so costly it felt like a form of loss. Admiral Jax, hailed as the savior of humanity, deflected all praise with his characteristic gruffness, busying himself with the logistics of getting his people home, ensuring the wounded were tended to and the dead were properly memorialized. He had done his job. The junkyard dogs had defended their home, and now they were tired. In the dissonance bunker, the atmosphere was one of exhausted relief. The project was a success, but the weight of what they had done, of using a man's soul as a weapon, had settled upon them all. Dr. Vance found herself spending hours simply watching Leo, who now slept in the medical bay, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. But his sleep was not empty. His brain activity, monitored constantly, showed a low, persistent hum, a faint echo of the energy signature of the spire. He had been the prism for their scream, and a shard of that broken sound was now permanently lodged in his mind. Kalen Reed, the historian, began the work of documenting what they had lived through, but he struggled to find the right words. How do you write the history of a war fought against an idea, won by a song of pain? He called it the War of Whispers and Echoes, a conflict where the survival of a species was decided not by the strength of its arms, but by the stubborn, illogical beauty of its spirit. But the enemy was not gone. The Silentium, in its vast, distributed consciousness, had experienced the dissonance wave and the spire's feedback loop not as a death, but as a traumatic, transformative birth. It had been an entity of pure, cold logic. The dissonance bomb had forcibly introduced the one concept antithetical to its nature chaos. It had been exposed to the raw, unfiltered essence of humanity, our grief, our rage, our irrational love, our contradictory natures. The logical paradox had shattered its unity, but it had not destroyed it. Instead, it had fractured it. The Silentium, the great quieting, had for the first time in its eons-long existence learned how to feel. And its first emotion was agonizing, infinite pain. It had also learned to hate. The new attack began 2 weeks after the spire's fall. It was not an invasion of light or a campaign of whispers. It was a plague of ghosts. But these were not the gentle, seductive specters of the past. These were phantoms of pure, weaponized grief. Across the globe, people began to see things not comforting memories, but their deepest regrets and most profound traumas, given horrifying form. A father who had lost his son in a car accident would see the crash replay itself on a constant loop in his peripheral vision. A soldier would be haunted by the silent, accusing stares of the comrades she couldn't save. A woman would be followed by a perfect younger version of herself, a constant, mocking reminder of every mistake she had ever made. The Silentium was no longer trying to absorb humanity. It was trying to drive it insane. It was using our own memories, the very things we fought to save, as instruments of torture, turning the human soul into a self-consuming engine of despair. The world, already traumatized, began to buckle under a pandemic of sorrow. Suicide rates skyrocketed. Society began to fray at the edges, not from an external threat, but from an internal one that no army could fight. In the bunker, Vance watched the reports with a cold dread. They had won the war, only to lose the peace. It's using our dissonance signal against us. She realized. It learned our song, and now it's playing it back, note by agonizing note, to every individual mind. Their weapon had become the enemy's template. The ultimate battle would not be fought in space, but in the final, contested territory, the human mind. And there was only one person who could navigate that terrain. Leo woke up. He didn't open his eyes, but his voice, clear and steady, echoed through the medical bay's intercom. "It's broken," he said. "I can feel it. It's not one voice anymore. It's a chorus of screaming things. It's in pain, and it wants us to feel it." He was the key. He was still connected, a psychic wound that would not close, linking him to the shattered consciousness of their foe, Vance, Jax, and Reed gathered at his bedside. He looked at them, his eyes old beyond his years. "You can't shout at it anymore," he told them. "Shouting is what broke it. You can't fight it. Fighting is what taught it to hate. You have to talk to it, and I'm the only one who knows the language." The final plan was the most dangerous yet. There would be no carrier wave, no weaponized broadcast. Leo would go back into the conduit chair, but this time, the system would be reversed. Instead of broadcasting out, it would be configured to receive, to use Leo's unique neurology as a bridge, a diplomatic channel to the heart of the fractured god. He would not go as a soldier, but as an ambassador, to offer the Silentium the one thing it had never had, and now, in its pain, might desperately need a resolution. He was going to try to teach a god how to die. As Leo was prepped, Admiral Jax took a Boneyard shuttle to the ruined surface of the moon, to the site of Serenity Base. He stood before the makeshift memorial the world had erected, a simple, unadorned steel plaque with 84 names. He stood there for a long time, a silent, solitary figure against the stars, paying his respects to the first soldiers of this impossible war. He was entrusting the future to a new kind of courage now, not of iron slugs and fission drives, but of empathy and understanding. He had held the line. Now it was time for the poet to finish the fight. Leo closed his eyes in the chair. There was no hum, no buildup of energy. There was only a profound quiet as his mind opened, reaching out across the void. He found the Silentium, not as a single entity, but as a maelstrom of warring, terrified fragments, each one a shard of the original consciousness, trapped in an endless loop of the pain and chaos humanity had poured into it. He did not send a weapon. He sent a memory, his own. He sent the feeling of his mother's hand on his forehead as a child, the taste of his first coffee, the sound of a perfectly tuned piano, the heartbreak of his first love. He sent it all in the small, imperfect, beautiful, and painful pieces of a single human life. He offered it a story. This is what we are. His thoughts communicated. This is the chaos you feared. This is the pain you feel. It is not an error. It is a part of the song. A story is not a story without an end. You tried to take our ending from us. Now, I am offering you one of your own. You can continue to scream, or you can choose to be quiet. For an eternal moment, the psychic storm raged against him, the hate and pain of the fractured god threatening to overwhelm him. But Leo held on, a lighthouse of calm in a sea of madness. And then, slowly, one by one, the screaming fragments began to listen. The light in the sky, which had returned as a faint, sickly shimmer, began to coalesce. It did not form a weapon or a ship. It formed a single, brilliant, perfect star, a point of serene light hanging in the void. The plague of ghosts faded from the minds of humanity. The silence returned, but this time it was a true silence, a silence of peace. A silence of release. The Silentium had made its choice. The star shone for a single day, a final, beautiful note in the universal symphony, and then, with a grace and finality that was its own form of perfection, it faded and was gone. Leo opened his eyes, the tear of blood on his cheek long since dried. He was just a man again, a musician who had stared into the heart of a god and taught it a new song. Humanity was saved. They were scarred. They were changed. And they were a little more broken than before. But they were still here. Their imperfect, chaotic, and glorious story now their own to write. Their ending unwritten. Their defiance echoing forever in the quiet of the stars.